Well, let me begin by wishing everyone watching a very happy 2022. I know beginning the new year with online services is probably not what any of us were expecting, and definitely not what any of us were wishing for. And who could believe nearly 2 years after first hearing about this curious virus, we would still find ourselves in this predicament. We are so grateful for everyone's patience and understanding through all this. Thank you so very much. Well, last year as pastors, we began 2021 by selecting some of our favorite and most personal passages of Scripture as the inspiration for our January messages. And instead of just simply preaching these passages in a traditional and expository manner, our goal was also to be a little more personal and share why each of these passages were so meaningful to us. Personally, one of the most difficult things was to actually choose which passage to share. And here's the funny thing. Over the course of this past year, there were several times where a particular passage would come to my mind and I would think, oh man, I wish I could share this scripture also as one of my favorites. And so for this reason, I'm just so grateful that once again, to begin 2022, we are revisiting this theme where we as pastors get the chance to share a few more of our favorite passages and why they mean so much to us. Now to begin, I am picking the favorite verse of one of my heroes, which just also happens to be my grandmother. One of our family's most treasured heirlooms is this book. This is actually the memoir of my grandmother, aka Nanny Bell. And she wrote specifically of her nearly 30 years living as a missionary in China near the Tibetan border. The name of her memoir is simply Nanny's Story, and it comes with the subtitle, In Weakness, Strength. This little line, this little subtitle is based on my grandmother's, my nanny's life verse, found in 2 Corinthians 2 verse 9, where Paul writes, "And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness." Obviously, I always loved this verse because it was closely connected with a woman I adored, and it was visible on the cover of her book along with a simple drawing of a Chinese landscape that was sketched by my father. However, it wasn't until I became a little older where the full weight of this simple verse started to hit home for me. First, as I got to know a little more of my nanny's own story and her lifelong battle with insecurity, and also realizing that I, like I'm sure many of us, we are all travelers down that same road, where personal insecurity is a demon we all, to some degree, actually have to do daily battle with. Now, a little later, I will share more of my own story, but first, let me give a little bit of context to what Paul is sharing here. I'm just going to call this the Corinthian context, because that's the group of believers he was writing this message to. First, let me go back a few verses just so you can see how this verse fits into Paul's train of thought. I'm going to pick things up at verse 5, and I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. That experience is worth boasting about. Now, this particular experience Paul is referring to is this unique revelation he experienced where he said he was caught up into the third heaven. But, and here's where Paul continues, I'm not going to do that. I will boast only about my weaknesses. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message. Even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord, please take it away. And here's the verse. And each time he said to me, my grace is all you need. My power or strength works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, to really understand what Paul is saying here, you actually need to understand the underlying context of Paul's letter. This letter is probably one of the most personal and probably one of the most difficult letters that Paul writes for us to understand. So context actually matters big time. But here are the basics. You see, Paul helped plant this church in Corinth with a couple named Priscilla and Aquila. And he actually stayed there for over 2 years. You can actually read about this in Acts chapter 18. This is also the place where he worked as a tent maker to make it happen and to help facilitate and finance the cost of starting this church. And after he left, some different teachers came in and different leadership also rose, and there were many, many problems that came with these new leaders, both theologically and morally. 1 Corinthians is basically Paul's letter dealing with all these problematic issues. And likely there was also a second letter he wrote somewhere between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It's referred to in chapter 7, verse 8 of 2 Corinthians. And it caused a lot of grief. And although Paul is gone, he's no longer in Corinth, he still loves these people. He still has this giant heart for them. And some, like Priscilla and Aquila, still love and respect Paul, while others, not so much. And they're beginning to think to themselves, well, who does this Paul think he is, telling us what to do? So throughout this entire letter, Paul is actually trying to balance out the proper tone he wants to get across. Paul is like a parent who just loves his child so much and can't help but be passionate and strong so his kid won't continue to make the same boneheaded choices that they're only going to regret later. But he also doesn't want to be too strong where he might drive a further wedge and do more damage. So Paul wants them to know he is right, but first he wants them to understand how much he loves them. And maybe if they know Paul's genuine heart, then possibly they might also begin to appreciate the wisdom and protection he is trying to offer. So in the midst of this letter, Paul goes into a bit of I'll call it a Rick Mercer rant, where he speaks directly to his critics, to those who are questioning his authority. And here Paul basically says, you ask me what kind of clout I have to speak to you? Well, here it is. Now, you really need to go back to at least the beginning of chapter 11 to pick up Paul's train of thought. But it is 11 verse 23 where he really lets loose and tells the Corinthians in no uncertain terms, this is what he writes, there is no one who has worked harder and been beaten up more for the gospel's sake than me. And listen to what he says. I know I sound like a madman, but I have served him far more. I have worked harder. I have been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number, and faced death again and again. And then on top of this, he adds that for some strange reason known only to God, God saw it fit to reveal himself to Paul and call on him to be his special apostle to the Gentiles. But instead of ending his rant boastfully, Paul actually does the opposite. He stops and declares that none of what he just boasted about really matters. Not what he has accomplished, not what he's been through, not what God has revealed to him. At the end of the day, he says, know this, what matters most is in all actuality, Paul had no business being in the position God had called him to. In fact, he says this, you want to know something? He says, I have this terrible weakness, this thing that he calls a thorn in the flesh, whatever that might be. There's lots of speculation about it. He even calls it this messenger from Satan. It's this debilitating weakness. We can only guess what it was. Yet in spite of this constant weakness, the great Paul pleads to God to get rid of. God simply says, nope, you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to work around it. And what Paul ends up boasting about is actually his weakness. This thing that should have made him give up and stop trying a long time ago, but that the fact that God in his grace still chose to use and work through Paul in spite of his inadequacy, this is what Paul believes is most amazing and what he wants this Corinthian church to grasp, to hold on to. I love this message so much. And I believe if there is a message so many people need to hear in our own day and age, it is this. And simply put, we can look at it this way. We have two ways of seeing ourselves. We can either see ourselves as the victim or as a victor. The victim is the person who always looks at their circumstances and always finds someone else to blame for whatever problems they have or whatever lack of motivation they might possess. They might think to this, well, I grew up poor. I was never a good student. I was brought up in a broken home. My nature is really shy. I've already made way too many mistakes. Nobody made more mistakes than Paul. I'll just put it at that. It doesn't take any of us very long to find reasons and people to blame for whatever issues we might be facing. So that's the first type of people, the victims. Or then there are those who are like Paul, who have all the excuses but say, I'm not letting them drive my agenda. I'm going to boast in the fact that I've overcome them and I've worked hard and been successful in spite of these obstacles. And this is where it gets a little personal for me. I've always appreciated this simple passage that was so inspiring to my nanny. It helped her overcome so much in her own life. But the weight of this simple verse, again, let me repeat it, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness, really hit home for me in the life of a very different person we read about in the Bible. It was probably in my early 20s, maybe late teens, and I was working my way through Bible college and looking to go into full-time Christian ministry. But I also felt completely insecure. As a kid, I was a terrible student and battled some different learning disabilities. I was terrified of public speaking. I constantly compared myself with others and never saw myself measuring up. On top of this, there was this youth leader in my life who liked to tell me that God could never use me unless I was morally pure 100% of the time, and I had to get my own act together perfectly before I could be of any use to anybody else. Truthfully, I actually assumed I would do overseas missionary work, primarily because I figured I could hide my insecurities better with strangers in a strange land. Yet then in the midst of my personal existential young adult crisis, I picked up my Bible and I started reading through Genesis. And specifically, I became obsessed with the story of Jacob. I read and reread Jacob's narrative. To this day, there's not a year that goes by where I do not revisit the Jacob story. So what was it about Jacob? Well, in brief, Jacob rocked my world and he rocked my faith. If I was to choose one word to describe Jacob as he's presented in the Bible, the only word that would adequately describe him, I think, would be the word scoundrel. Now, I'm not going to go through the Jacob narrative, but here are just a couple of lowlights you should know. First of all, Jacob was a lifelong deceiver and a manipulator. He was neither a good husband or a father. In fact, his family would make our own estranged and dysfunctional families look idealistic in comparison. Yet despite these characteristics of Jacob, none of which I'm here advocating or would ever advocate, and please note this, Jacob paid dearly for the mistakes he made. But what stood out so profoundly to me, and I know we should never compare ourselves with others, but despite all of Jacob's obvious shortcomings, this was the guy God chose as one of the fathers of the nation of Israel, who God, in some bizarre way that makes sense to him, wanted himself to be identified with, to be distinguished as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, if it were me, Jacob is the kind of guy I would want to distance myself from. Yet God doesn't even just leave it there. It is Jacob who God gives a new name to. He gives him the name Israel, which means wrestles with God. And it is Jacob who ends up being the namesake of God's people, the Jews, Israel. And this is how my pea brain works. If God could somehow use and work with a scoundrel and as someone as undeserving as Jacob, then how could I doubt? How could I possibly question that God could use and work with someone like myself? And I realized serving God is actually far more about being faithful than it is about being perfect. After I was hit between the eyes with this revelation from the life of Jacob, I soon stumbled back across my nanny's life verse. And again, let me repeat it. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. The truth, the power of it hit me in a whole new way. It was no longer just my grandmother's life verse. It was now also very personal to me. And it also allowed me to appreciate the incredible power behind it, especially as it related to my Nanny Belle. You see, here was this insecure young lady with little confidence. Yet she somehow mustered the courage to leave home, travel across the globe to one of the most remote corners of our planet, learn a strange language, raise a family, serve the impoverished, the uneducated, and the unreached, deal with adventure and hardship and heartache beyond whatever I could possibly imagine, and do it all because of the profound love and power of Christ at work within her. And if God's power could shine through the corrupted life of Jacob, a murderous thug like Paul, or a fragile, insecure life like my grandmother's, well, then maybe it was time to believe and trust that God could work through a fragile vessel like myself. Here's the thing. Every one of us, we all have excuses, and many of them are really reasonable, as to why we can't do this or can't do that. In all honesty, we are all plagued with our own weaknesses and insecurity. Many of us, probably like Paul, have prayed to God for him to take them away from us. God, please make me smarter. God, please make me more independent. God, make me wealthier, just a little bit more money. God, make me more confident. God, make me less emotional. God, give me better health. God, help me conquer this addiction, right? We all have 1,000 thorns in our flesh. But let me say this. As we enter into another uncertain new year, let's enter it knowing this promise still stands, that his grace is still sufficient for you and for me, and his strength is still made perfect, even in spite of our weaknesses. Do not let your insecurities get the better of you. Rather, trust the one who promises us that when we put our faith in him, his power, his strength, his grace can be made perfect and possibly even shine the brightest through and in the midst of our limitations and inadequacies. Again, it is Paul who tells us, now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Rely on his strength and see past your own weaknesses. Again, my nanny's story is just entitled, In Weakness, Strength. Her weakness, God's strength. I hope the same is for you as well. God bless, and Happy New Year.